organizations, political groups, and medical associations have denounced the stereotyping, have denounced the cultural misappropriation and the insulting use of these mascots and logos, describing them as harmful, misleading, and disrespectful. 20 years ago, the Society of Indian Psychologists released a statement that read in part, "Stereotypical and historically inaccurate images of Indians in general interfere with learning about them by creating, supporting, and maintaining oversimplified and inaccurate views of indigenous peoples and their cultures." There are an estimated 2 million Native American children living in this country. 1/3 of them will live in poverty. Many struggle with confidence and self-esteem. They will experience the highest suicide rates in America. They are the only racial group whose high school graduation rates are decreasing. During their lifetimes, they will be bombarded by the images like the ones behind me that perpetuate misrepresentation and ignorance. So thank you for attending this session, and I am happy to introduce our first speaker, JEA Dante. You want to stand, or you want to stand here, or you want to sit there?
I will control this. So sometimes people say, why are we even having this debate in sports, for example? And the only time the subject rears its head is when it comes to the topic of nicknames and mascots and logos, and especially when compared to some of the serious issues facing Native Americans that you just heard Patty describe, this might seem rather trivial. It's just a logo. Why are you so concerned about it? Mm-hmm. And that's actually my response as well. It is just a logo. So the thing that catches my attention is that we say that we want to move past racism, that we want to progress, that we want to get better as a country. And very few people are willing to admit that they are racist. So if that's the case, then why is it so hard to get rid of these logos? That should really tell you something about the challenges in overcoming racism in this country, the fact that it has been a multi-decade battle to do something as simple as change a logo, to get rid of an offensive nickname. And you wonder, is there any easier way to score anti-racism points than by dropping a logo, by changing a nickname? So if everyone proclaims that they are not racist, that they want to see equality among the races, this should be the easiest way to score points on that side. And yet you still continue to see resistance in that regard. And that's my response too. People say, well, it's just a logo, why are you so offended? Well, if it's just a logo, why are you so resistant to change? Joe Posnanski recently wrote a column upon the end of the Cleveland baseball team season, which subsequently meant the end of the Chief Wahoo logo appearing on any official apparel. I guarantee you it's not the last that we've seen of it, because there have been millions of items sold, and in fact, I just saw someone, literally as I was walking in here, I saw someone sitting outside on the hallway wearing an Indians jersey with a Chief Wahoo hat. So there's millions of these products in existence. The reason why we've continued to see them, even the last 2 years, as Major League Baseball has finally said, hey, you might want to do something about this and get rid of this offensive, stupid grinning logo. So I saw a story, and even the owner of the team at the time said, we acknowledge the offense that it has, and we want to do something to address it. And I was saying, okay, well, why haven't you done anything? In the very next paragraph, it said that items with the Chief Wahoo logo were the top selling items in the Cleveland team store. So it's been kept alive by people and now it's almost become an act of defiance. But I do believe, to some degree, there's this nostalgia factor. I don't understand why there's nostalgia for this team when it's never won anything in the lifetime of most of the people who are certainly in this room. So it's not even memories of the good times when we saw them win the championship. No, they've never won anything while you've been alive. So why are you so attached to this logo that is literally a symbol of futility in addition to being a very offensive symbol? But Joe Posnanski made a good point in his blog that he wrote. So he said, these are the logos of Major League Baseball teams that are in existence in 1971. And so you can see, as you look at them, very few of them bear any resemblance to the logos that we see in existence today. So here's today. You notice just about the only one that hasn't changed is the one that needs to change the most. This one, which the only noticeable difference I can see is it used to be facing left, now it's facing right. That's their attempt to modernize, I guess. But virtually every other team has changed its logo. And in a lot of ways, sometimes it's simply trying to get a cleaner, simpler logo that reproduces better at various sizes. Sometimes it's just updating to the times. Sometimes the teams have changed. The Montreal Expos are now the Washington Nationals. But for whatever the reasons, they've all changed. There was no resistance to them. And yet, the one team that needs to change the most is the one that looks the same as 1971. So part of it is, how about getting updated and modernizing, right? In addition to getting a cleaner logo that looks more reflective of the times, you also might want to leave this ancient mindset behind that thinks it's okay to trivialize people and to exaggerate the grosser stereotypes of the people and have them displayed on your hat or on your sleeve at the time. Another point I want to make, an example of the type of pushback you encounter. So on October 8th of this year, as I was watching the Major League Baseball playoffs, I took great delight in the fact, well, I was happy that my Dodgers were winning. But as they were eliminating the Braves, that meant we wouldn't have to hear that obnoxious tomahawk chop anymore and see that. And of course, because Cleveland pledged to get rid of the Wahoo logo at the end of this season and not use it in any official capacity anymore, as soon as their season was over, that meant goodbye to that. So I delightfully tweeted, both A, to revel in the moment, but also as a little experiment, in part knowing that this panel was coming up that I was going to be speaking on. I just wanted to do a little social media experience to see what type of reaction I would get when I tweeted, quote, "The tomahawk chop has been silenced for the season, and Chief Wahoo has been bounced from baseball for good. Hashtag today was a good day." I did get 1,000 likes on it, but the first response was, "Congrats, you're 100% what's wrong with sports media today. You should be bounced for good instead." Among others, some people felt compelled. Here's someone whose Twitter handle is Chief Wahoo is sexy, and simply replied, "No." Someone else sent this other person's response, the Chief Wahoo logo on a hat. Someone else sent a glistening Chief Wahoo logo. Someone else asked, "How is the tomahawk chop offensive?" I don't think I can explain that in 240 characters, 280 characters. You get a lot of remarks about, oversensitivity and things like that. But again, who's being overly sensitive? The one that is crying about the prospect of changing a logo when we see how every other logo in Major League Baseball has changed and yet they can't bring themselves to change theirs? Or the people who are just saying, you might want to try something that's a little less racist. And then you can get positive points for being part of the solution rather than being part of the resistance to progress. So that's what I have encountered. I don't take up too much time because we have people who are much more expert than me, but in my 2.5 decades as a sports journalist, it's just a little example of how the debate continues and how the resistance on something that should be the easiest step to take if we're pursuing equality, and yet we still are fighting it to this day. And I haven't gotten into the Washington football team's nickname and other aspects of that, but just this small matter of the logo, which we've seen that other teams can change so easily. I think there's just a resistance to being told what to do and having to acknowledge that something is wrong, that times have changed and we've made progress, but yet certain elements of our sports society are stuck in the 1940s and 50s and before.
Thank you, Jay. And again, I want to point out October 8th was Columbus Day in some parts of the country, but also Indigenous Peoples Day. And so it was pretty interesting timing and ironic, to say the least, that the Atlanta professional team got bounced from its World Series run on Indigenous Peoples Day.
And the Washington NFL team lost that night.
So it was a good day to be Indigenous. Our next speaker is Karina Dominguez.
Hello. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what JEA had talked about with people being resistant to change. They don't really want to be told what to do. And there's actually some new research coming out on that. So Stephanie Freiberg, she's the lead psychologist on this social science that's coming out that shows the detrimental impacts it has on Native American people, particularly our youth. So I'm going to show you guys a clip shortly here.
It's gonna be a while.
Yeah, no rush.
Okay.
So you'll have a better idea of the kind of work that's being done to try to end this, and a lot of the research that has been shown. But just to give you a little background, so Native American youth are the most impacted by this. So this has to do with identity development. This has to do with self-esteem issues. So Stephanie Freiberg, she says that, you know, when you show these people these mascots, they actually see themselves, and they see themselves in less roles than they see themselves when they don't see, you know, these mascots. So they see themselves doing far, you know, better, brighter things with their future when they don't see the mascots, but when they see it, they really limit, they put the blinders on, they really limit what they think that they can do. So the research is clear, the data has been clear on that end, but some newer research that they're doing actually explores, you know, what does this do for, you know, white children when they show these images to white children, not just Native children. And it actually has the opposite effect. So that is new, they're still exploring that, but it might go to show why it's so hard to change these things, why it's taken so long, why, you know, we haven't had on.
I don't know why it's not showing.
So anyway, so these logos, they have a negative impact, you know, and there is new research showing why this might not, why this might be.
Been trying to find something.
Hit Windows P, select it.
What?
Do you want to come over here? Thank you.
So we're trying to.
We just need a
we were
techie.
playing for
That's
the
all,
game.
we just need one. We need an eighth grader.
Right. Just need a high schooler.
So Stephanie's work has been really important. You know, she's been really instrumental in, you know, pushing. So the American Psychological Association back in 2003, maybe in 2005, they actually came out and called for the immediate retirement of all Native mascots. Okay, that's fine. No, it's okay. So they actually called for the immediate retirement of all Native mascots because of the detrimental impacts it has shown to have. You know, this is kind of equivalent to having, you know, images like Sambo. I don't know if you guys know that with reference, but, you know, having an image like that, you know, in the Deep South, you know, that's the equivalent of having, you know, the Redskins team in Washington. So, oh no, it's okay. That's fine. I just wanted to show you a clip. So we don't have a clip, but I do have a documentary. It's called More Than a Word. This was produced by two brothers, John and Ken Little. They're both from the Sioux Nation, and they both used to heavily support a Native mascot at their university. It was a Native mascot, but they changed that, and they, you know, have come to the realization of, you know, why it's bad, and they are really passionate about sharing, you know, their story and sharing this message. So if you guys are interested, I can definitely get you guys in contact with them. They're, you know, really happy that you guys are here and that you guys are interested in this topic. So, so going back to, you know, some of the other issues Jay had mentioned, a lot of people seem to think that this is a new issue. You know, why are people caring about this now? It's actually been going on since the 60s. So I have Barb over here. She has been doing a lot of work for decades. This has been going on. It's really interesting, actually. So in the 60s, you know, people realized it is bad and this is something that needed to change. It was dehumanizing us. At the exact same time, Native American children were still being taken away from their families in the 60s. That was still ongoing. So I think there was a huge effort then because they realized the connection that it had then And another thing is, people say, why are they talking about this now? But also, why are they talking about this when there are quote unquote real issues? As Patty mentioned, high suicide rates, low high school graduation rates, high substance abuse rates. There's a lot of really heavy things going on Native communities. But these things are not independent of this issue. Everything is interconnected. So that is, kind of the first step when people try to argue. I often engage with Twitter trolls and stuff like that too. And there's really no good reason to keep these things. And I think a lot of people just don't know how harmful it is. They don't know about the research. They don't know how, when someone is going to commit suicide, when someone is, seeking substances, that type of thing, there are feelings that they're having that, are dealing with, feelings of worthlessness and stuff like that, and having images like these logos, that definitely goes hand in hand with this issue. So I don't have the video, but I would like to show you guys, there's a number of people who are actually actively working to get rid of this. And I know a lot of people, I spoke with some of you guys at the booth on Thursday and Friday, and some people said, oh, this was really, a hot topic and it's kind of gone away. Maybe some of the media attention has gone away from it, but the resistance and the continuing efforts by people like Barb and her husband and other people that they're working with, Richie, you guys met, at the booth as well, that is ongoing. People are still talking about it. People have been working on it for decades. This is not something that has just gone away. So I just wanted to leave you guys with a few tips. So as student journalists, I know some of you I talked to actually have the Native mascot at your school, like the chiefs and other things like that. So as a journalist, if you guys have a newspaper, I highly encourage you guys to write a piece, talk about this panel, talk about some of the information you've learned, talk about, why it's detrimental. What are these effects? The American Psychological Association, they've got a very brief summary, so you can actually pull that up, and you can get some. That's another valuable resource that you could use to quote in your article. So I would encourage you to do that. And even if you guys don't have, those kind of mascots at your school, maybe there's a school in the district or in a neighboring area. But I highly encourage you guys to, write a piece, call them out. I think that anytime the opportunity presents itself, you should address the issue. Because sometimes people think, oh, well, if I just stay quiet, don't say anything, remain neutral, kind of stay out of, these confrontations. But in reality, silence is never neutral. It's only helping the oppressor, really. So, it is tiring, to address it every time you see it. On my way here, I was sitting next to a gentleman who had a logo on his hat, and I was really tired. I was really exhausted. I'd done a lot of traveling already, so I was thinking about it. I was like, oh, should I talk to him? And when we got off of the plane, I don't want to sit there awkwardly next to him the whole time, so when we got off of the plane, I did discuss it with him a little bit, but, it's hard to address it every single time, but as long as you're talking about it, as long as you're sharing the information that you learn, as long as you're letting people know, you're definitely making a difference. So I just wanted to let you guys know that. And I also encourage you to learn more about the Native American communities that you live around, because I'm sure there are some, and you can, find out who they are, where do they live, what's their history like, were they relocated, is this where they originated from, do they have cultural events that are open to the public? Because if they do, I would highly encourage you to attend, just so you know, the community you're in, the community you're reporting on, just to get yourself familiar. And I'd also encourage you to be aware of your own biases. There is this really interesting test that Harvard designed. It's called the implicit bias test. If you just Google Harvard implicit bias test, it's the first thing that pops up. So they actually have a couple of tests designed to gauge, where you are on the spectrum for a lot of different things. So not just race, but gender, a bunch of other things. But they've got a race test. They've also have one that's specific to natives, which I found really interesting when I took it several years ago. Most people who take the test actually view Native American people as foreigners and as different when we're really the only people who originated from these lands. So I thought that was really interesting. But it would just, if you take the test, you'll be able to, see and kind of, in a way on the spectrum, like gauge, where you are. And from there, they give you a brief description about what your result means. And from there, you can think about this issue more analytically, and you can think about better ways that you can approach it. So I think you should definitely do that. And another thing is, a lot of times, and I'm in the media, as Patty mentioned, I was working at a major network in New York. Now I'm actually back home, and I'm working in Tucson at the local affiliate. But when I was working there, I really tried to push them to correct the reporting. A lot of the reporting really focused on, especially when the Cleveland team, announced they weren't going to be using the logo anymore. A lot of our evening writers, they were talking about how, you can still load up on all your Wahoo gear and all this stuff, rather than talking about this is a huge win for the Native community because of the detrimental impacts it has on Native people, especially the youth. So they don't really talk about that at all. So, it was hard to even get them to correct the reporting at that level. And I'm sure if you guys, decide that, this is something that you care about and this is something that you want to make sure you're accurately reporting on, you might face some backlash, from editors, people who might not, have the same knowledge that you do. And I encourage you to not be discouraged. Go ahead and, don't, a lot of times they'll say, you can't be biased. I used to work for Sunday Morning, so the executive producer of that show, he says, well, I don't know, about covering this. It's a very controversial issue. But really it's not. There's right and there's wrong. There's racist and not racist. So there's not really a gray area. This isn't something like politics. It's really black and white as far as, this issue goes. So I would, definitely encourage you to tell them, that, you refuse to use a racial slur or, derogatory images, and ask why they think it's okay. Encourage them to address their own bias. Because a lot of times they don't even realize that that is something that they have. It's, detrimental to Native youth. There's no good reason to keep it. Dan Snyder, in the clip I wanted to show, he's talking about, the real issues we're facing and all this stuff. And, really, why keep it? Why not get rid of it? So many teams change their logos all the time. They rebrand, they get complete, new teams, going. So it could be a new economic opportunity for them to, profit off of new merchandise. So why not do it? Part of it has to do with the research, not wanting to be told what to do. Maybe they feel, superior because of these things. But the other thing is, it really just boils down to exploitation, profiting off of, negatively impacting Native children's lives. It's not a good thing. So I just encourage you to educate yourself on best practices when you're reporting on Native communities. I'm with the Native American Journalists Association, so we did bring some material. It'll be outside of these doors if you guys want to take a look. We actually have an AP style book page. It'll fit right in your AP style book. And you can reference it whenever you're talking about not just this issue, but any kind of tribal issue. There's also some good information on where you can go for more information. So I encourage you to take a look there. If you have any questions or comments, concerns, I'm Karina. You can definitely find me on LinkedIn or anything like that after the event. I'd love to talk to you. And if you write any stories, if you're gonna push your school or another school to try to change their mascot, please let me know. I would love to, be updated on any kind of progress that you guys make or anything you write. Thank you guys.
We haven't given up on your clip yet. Cole is gonna,
Okay.
excuse me, take a look while Margaret is talking. I wanted to say just one thing. Something that Karina said is really important. Are you guys familiar with the term false equivalency?
Yes.
Okay. So we know in climate change, 98% of the world scientists agree that the climate is changing. And when the media interview one of those scientists who's explaining climate change and then finds the, some random scientist of the 1 or 2% who are not convinced that climate change is real, and present them side by side in a network news story, it creates this sense of false equivalency. The same is true with mascots. There are maybe 1 or 2 Indian nations that have said mascots are okay, but the vast majority of Indian nations, the National Congress of American Indians, the Native American Journalists Association, the American Indian College Fund, every credible Native American organization that has the right to speak on behalf of Native people has come out and said this is wrong. So when you as a journalist are doing a story like this, it's important that you convey that the random person you may find who says, I love my mascot, I don't want to give it up, is a very, very small minority, represents a small minority. So I think, if there's one thing that I would ask you as aspiring journalists, student journalists, to do is not contribute to that sense of a false equivalency. All right, so here's Margaret Holt of the Chicago Tribune.
I do want to ask a couple questions first. I am thrilled to be here. We have had at the Tribune a steady stream of visitors who are at the conference who come to see us in the newsroom. And I am so grateful that so many of you turned up on a Saturday afternoon for this discussion. A little help here. I'm curious, how many of you in the audience have some Native identity? That's a fair number, okay. And any racial or cultural or ethnic identity? Another show of hands. Some more. Okay, that is great news to people like me and my colleagues, because we need allies. We need people to understand. The Native Americans, and I come from the perspective of mainstream journalism, we are the least represented of all the different types of ethnic and minority backgrounds. And we need more voices. In all of America, the last ASME survey said we're something like, 160 in all of mainstream journalism in America. And so it's really important that we have people who are not necessarily Native American, but who understand what these issues are and are sensitive to them. So I thank you very much for coming today. It's extremely important. So a week ago, I went to the Chicago Humanities Festival, and Ron Chernow, who is the famous author of the book Hamilton that became the inspiration for the musical Hamilton, was speaking. And he talked about, in looking at today's times, he talked about slavery as the original sin, and that some of the consequences of that are still playing out in our society. And I would offer that perspective is, even more than original sin, look at where Native Americans were in the picture from the very beginning. If you want to talk slavery, and it is horrible, the Constitution still identified blacks as 3/5 of a human being, right? 3/5 of a person. Think about that. The math on that is just outrageous. But just as outrageous and even worse, we, Native Americans, didn't even exist. We existed to be savages, to be destroyed. The avowed policy of the federal government in regard to Native Americans has been genocide until the late 1800s, and until the early 1900s. And so these issues have a very long context. Is that okay again? These issues have a very, very long tail in history. I would argue that if you go back to, Native Americans have trailed some of the changes in society that have happened for African Americans by about 60 years culturally. So if you wonder why there's another surge of interest in the mascot issue and how it affects Native Americans, just look to the context. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which dealt with the giving black people the right to vote and citizenship and to be real people, those all were in the 1860s. It was not until 1922 and then 1924 that Native Americans were identified. The Indians, it happened in, was it 1924, I believe, the Indian Citizenship Act is when it came to fruition. So 60 years we have trailed the the acknowledgement of our presence in American society. And the same thing happened, another little coda so you can see where these things play. In 1954, which is memorable as the year of the critical Brown versus the Board of Education, which absolutely set us on a different trail, laid the groundwork for what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That same year, the most famous holiday movie of all time came out, White Christmas. And people forget, if you watch that movie now, and you'll see it on cable, holidays are coming, right? In that movie, because it was a product of its time, there was an extended scene of a blackface routine, a minstrel show. And instead of appearing in blackface, the characters, you know, Danny Kaye and the other characters, they wore, you know, long white gloves, and they did the Mr. Bones thing. Now, do you think for a minute that people of color looked at that and thought that was a great thing? But we took it for granted because that was of the time. So here we are. You know, I would argue that in effect, some of these mascots, like the Illinois, like this, they're minstrels. That is a minstrel show. And only now are we, Native Americans, getting our due 60 plus years later. So we're just following what has happened in our American history over this time. And it is so important to us because we are such a small group compared, I like to say we lost the real estate battles early on. We are such a small group in comparison with other groups that others recognize this. And it gives me great hope that young people are some of the most appreciative of diversity issues. And so the timing is right, and you know, the opportunity for you to learn more about this, I hope you do, and appreciate how large an issue this is for all of us. Then I have a little bit of historical context for you, and I will be brief, on the whole issue in Illinois. You know, I started out post-college, I started out in downstate Illinois, and it was unbelievable to me that the Pekin High School mascot, the Chinks, seriously, the Pekin Chinks. And it was the same stuff you hear now. It was, we didn't mean to harm anybody. We didn't intend to be offensive, right? Well, how, you know, and you look back from the benefit of now, and there's a whole school of presentism in history analysis that asks you to think about context. When you look back, is it really fair to apply current day standards to past moments? And I think we all learn, and we all have to be willing to accept that we're going to change and think about things in different ways. It took an act of the Illinois legislature to get rid of the Pekin Chinks, and that was in 1980. By 1981, they had a new mascot. In Illinois, I can't tell you, it's a broken record. It's like the movie Groundhog Day. The Illinois, it just never goes away. That, you know, it was a subject of great controversy, and then along about, gosh, I'm thinking 2005 or 6, it began to heat up, and then in roughly, I think, I'm not sure the date, was it 2008 or thereabouts, about 10 years ago, that the University of Illinois administration banned the Chief Illinois. They eliminated that mascot, but they did that, but they made a critical error, I think, and my newspaper has editorialized about this repeatedly. They failed to identify a substitute mascot, which has just left it kind of, you know, in limbo. And it means that a lot of these people who like to suggest that somehow Chief Illinois, quote, honors Native Americans, has got a chance to come back. And I really think, and we have editorialized about this, columnists have written about it, I really think if they named a different mascot, you know, the alpines, the tree, the fruit, or whatever, I don't care. What if they gave them a different name? Then I think it would be much harder for that. You know, it would make it a clean cut, and so it has not happened. So one other point I wanted to make about mainstream journalism, you never underestimate the socialization by virtue of process. The Associated Press in its style book is a major source of a lot of the framing of this issue, and they do not view things like the Redskins name as a slur, even though many Native Americans, I would say most, but at least many do. So until the formal names of the team, and they always say, oh, well, you know, the formal name of the team is XYZ, and our agate things are set up so that when it flows through the agate system, and it's automated now, it'll be these names of these teams. So we have that to work against, and I think just be aware of that. So if you have an opportunity, ask the question, do you really need to say it? Because we don't necessarily. Again, that's really all I wanted to bring up, and I thank you very much for coming today. I'm so happy to see this level of interest in what is, for many of us, a really important topic, so thank you.
And we think we figured out the audio challenges, so.
Sorry, there's a couple more things I kind of forgot. So I just wanted to talk about Amanda Blackhorse, and she was one of the lead plaintiffs on a fight to get the Washington team to change their name. But just to give you an example of, you know, how bad the backlash is when people try to make some progress on this issue, she talks about in this documentary how, you know, they're $1 billion corporation. You know, the NFL makes a lot of money. And after 2014, when she was getting a lot of, you know, hate messages and, you know, people on Twitter and social media, and she felt like she was actually being watched outside of her house. Her accounts were hacked. So these were the kind of things she was dealing with going up against a multi-million-dollar, you know, organization. So it's a serious thing, you know, it's not just, oh, like it's these stupid mascots. You know, these are real issues, and they're, you know, heavy. Let's see if this audio works.
We're talking about eliminating Indian mascots.
I think we're still having issues with it.
No,
But
okay.
it
it's
was
not
worth a
meant to
shot.
be. Sorry about that. Well, should we,
There was another clip that I wanted to show you guys in here about Native mascots. It was actually one of the gentlemen who was interviewed. He referenced a James Baldwin quote where they're talking about being called the N-word, you know, by a white person, and it's something along the lines of, you know, I'm not mad that he's calling me the N-word, you know, I'm just worried, I'm just curious to why he needs me to be that. So in a way, you know, he's shedding light on how these issues aren't just impactful, you know, have negative impacts on Native people, but they also harm everybody, you know, white people included, you know, so if he's not the N-word that they think he is, then that means then you're not the white person that you thought you were. So meaning, you know, in another way, you know, maybe you weren't so deserving of these material things that you inherited or the white privilege that you benefit from. So I thought that was a pretty powerful quote. Sorry that this didn't work out, guys, but it's a really cool documentary, and if you're interested, and if you are really wanting to, you know, change a name at your school or within your district, I would highly recommend you trying to get this film maybe shown. I don't know if you're a part of a journalism class that would, you know, help you, you know, show this or organize a screening or something, but I think it would definitely help people understand this issue better. And I'm sure the directors would love to, you know, have you guys share this at your high school. Yeah?
Oh, sure. I just wanted to ask, what was the name of the film?
It's called More Than a Word, and you can actually find them on social media. They're on Instagram. I have contact info for the two brothers who directed the film. Yeah?
Yeah, I just want to mention the film. We had a screening last November in Prescott, and it was well attended by the community, and John Little is going to be visiting Prescott on
Nice.
December 6th.
Awesome.
So yeah, they're great, and the school district can get a great rate for the film. So yeah, the screening was really, really well attended. We had a great turnout, great discussion. Yeah.
Awesome, that's great to hear. So yeah, if you guys are interested, please reach out, and we can definitely make sure that you guys can, you know, organize that, because this is a serious issue. You know, I'm Native American, and I'm not like some Native people who you know, you can't really tell that they're Native. You know, I'm distinctly Native looking, and I didn't realize it growing up in all the ways that this impacted my life. It wasn't until I was in college where I really came to the realization that, you know, this is bad, and I didn't understand how insidious these issues are, how insidious this is, these images, and how they work on a subconscious level, you know, so you aren't even aware of it. There's a quote one of my professors had told me. So a Native scholar once said, in reference to people who, claim the heritage but don't, overtly look like they're Native. But it says, you don't know what it's like to be Native unless at one point you wish you weren't. Which is sad to say, but that's the truth. At least for me, I wasn't fortunate enough to grow up in a very traditional household where we were really taught to be very prideful in who we are as Yaqui people. So I did struggle with that, and I did face bullies throughout school who made me feel bad about being Native, and it really affected the way I grew up. So now I'm very passionate and very outspoken about this issue, and I hope that you guys understand, how serious it is and how it's not just this trivial thing that people try to make it seem like it is. If you guys have any other questions, let us know.
All right, I think this is a good time to open our conversation up for questions. Yeah, Bob.
I'm Bob Munson of the Wisconsin Indian Education Association, and something was mentioned that made me think, as journalists, future journalists, people interested in journalism, if you're writing a story or broadcasting a story and it's about the Washington, and I'll say the Washington Redskins, you don't have to say Redskins in your story. You can say Washington. Any nickname, whatever, you don't have to use that nickname in your story. Often it will boil down to an editorial viewpoint, but I know around us up in central Wisconsin, there have been some newspapers that won't. They'll say, instead of the Mosinee Indians, Mosinee. Instead of the Cleveland Indians, Cleveland. So that's one little thing that you can interject into your repertoire. And for Patty's benefit, with a couple minutes left to go, it's Wisconsin 31, Rutgers 10.
How did Rutgers get 10 points is what I want to know. Yeah, JEA has the response.
Excellent point. You have control. Some organizations have taken a policy. The Portland Oregonian newspaper has declared that they will not refer to Washington's team by its nickname, and so you just won't see that name in that newspaper. Peter King, when he was running the Monday Morning Quarterback site, he made it his personal policy. He was not going to use that name in print, so it's very easy to do. We kind of have an unofficial around the horn policy that we don't use the name. Every once in a while it kind of slips out. We don't stop the show and do it over if somebody does mention it. But we just kind of decided, and even when we're discussing off camera, if we're talking about the team's going to come up. We just try to avoid it, just to try to get out of the habit of using the name. We don't want to be sitting with a microphone on, with a camera on us, even if we're not taping, even if we're not broadcasting live, we don't want to use that name. So that's a very simple way that you can take control and take a step forward. Again, if you don't want to be identified as a racist, one way to do it is to not use racist language, to not perpetuate racist imagery.
You can take it a step
Can I ask a
further.
question? How many of you are from schools that have race-based mascots? Is there a way that in that, JA just gave you some really good advice, and Bob echoed that, don't use the name. But in not using the name, can you at the end of your story in italics say, it's always a disclaimer with every story that doesn't have a race-based nickname in it, where, we have deliberately not used the race-based mascot name of our school, and it's just something that appears in every sports story where you don't use the name. I'm wondering if that would be a...
I don't see why you can't do that. And there's one more thing that you can do if you want to take it to the Washington slurs. Simply refer to them as the Washington slurs.
All right. Question? Yeah.
So I live in a very sports affiliated community, and and in sociology we stand a lot behind how toxic the Native mascots can be. But I was just wondering, how do you respond to the argument that the native mascots are like, it's like cherishing their heritage or it's like representing them. I know it sounds so stupid, but like I never know how to respond to that, and I want to know how, like, what is your reasoning?
You know, that comes up all the time in coverage. I mean, how many times, and it's that was what they said back in, you know, Illinois in the 70s and 80s about the Peak and Chinks. It's like, oh, we're honoring them. That's whatever. You know, it's very difficult because then I think you just say, that may have been, but that is not the case now. You know, it's offensive to people, and we have to consider that.
And I think the other thing too is it is disparaging. There's a lot of data that shows that this has negative impacts on these children. That is kind of what I always refer to when I get these trolls on the internet who are like, oh, this is all about honor and this and that. But in reality, you know, these images are created by non-natives. You know, oftentimes they're white people creating these images. They're, you know, basically like, it's like they're trying to say that we're all one type of people, like this monolithic, but it's not true, you know? There are so many, I don't know if you guys know this, but over 500 federally recognized tribes within the US, and there's over 300 who are in the process of trying to become federally recognized. So that's easily like around 1,000, you know, just less than 1,000 of different Native American cultures. You know, it's like I can't speak my native language to Barb over here from the Oneida Nation because our languages are completely different. You know, it's like it's like speaking Chinese and Spanish. You know, there's no way we could communicate with each other. So I think a lot of people don't understand how diverse and how rich our cultures are and how different they are because of these kind of stereotypes. But in short, you know, the data says otherwise. It's not honoring. This is outright. It's an outright attack on our citizens, is what it is.
Can I add one little thing? The wonderful Suzanne Schoen Harjo, who is just a great leader, has a wonderful way of putting this. She says, when does it become the right of the oppressor to define what is oppressive? And I think whenever I wonder about whether I should speak up, I let Suzanne's words sort of play in my head.
One of the things I'll do is I'll keep asking questions. Oh, you think, well, explain to me, how is it honoring Native Americans to have, you know, Chief Wamp? Well, and they'll just say, well, we've always done that. Well, why do you think that is that you've always done it? And whatever they, because ultimately they're going to wind up digging a hole for themselves. One of the things, I do a lot of public speaking, or did, with service groups, and inevitably, whenever, no matter what I'm talking about, inevitably some guy in the back will ask about mascots. And it's always prefaced by, I want to ask you about mascots, but I want to tell you that I went to a school that had a mascot, and we always thought it was honoring Native people, and it was a great source of pride. What do you think? You know, and it always, I mean, that's always the way the question goes. And one of my responses seemed to really resonate. And what I said to that gentleman was, let's say you have a favorite aunt that gives you a present for your birthday or a holiday, and you open it up, and it's a lime green leisure suit with fuzzy bunnies on it, and she insists that you put it on, and you look at it and you think, you know, it's just so ugly. You don't want to put it on, but she insists and said, you know, she made it for you and she wants you to wear it. You put it on, you look at yourself in the mirror, and you are absolutely mortified in it. Who has the right to tell you that you have to wear that ugly suit? The person that thinks they're honoring you with it, or the person that actually has to wear that? And that seemed to resonate with this group, actually.
And the opposing seems too.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I know you guys have been using Native Americans throughout. Do you prefer to be like if you're referred to as a group, do you prefer to be called by your specific nation, Native Americans, indigenous peoples, like what term?
Specific.
You know, it's situational and it's sort of geographic, and it's even generational. My grandfather always referred to himself as American Indian. My mother hates that term and will correct anybody. I think most times Native people want to be referred to, if you can refer to them by their formal tribal name, their nation. I would prefer to be called Ojibwe. But I realize that in the collective, you have to come up with a term. I think it's always best to ask the person what they prefer. But Native American, Native person, Indigenous person, First Nations is a great descriptor, but most people, when they hear First Nations, think of Canada. Anybody else have any?
You know, I really love the energy of young people around these issues because language matters, language is behavior. And it's the first, once people are sensitive to that, it's the first step towards real and significant cultural change. So I think these things are really, really important. And young people, for instance, have me thinking about things in a different way because they'll talk all the time about, well, the colonials, and I'm like, oh yeah, you know, because my mother was of that generation that was A-okay with American Indian. It didn't bother her one bit. She would choose that. But she was also of the generation that was the boarding school era, and was taken from her family and raised in boarding school to strip her of her identity and culture when she was a child, an infant. So she was a lot different from people who are younger now and who are reclaiming the life that was taken away from them, their identities. And so it really is a really critical thing, and the younger people being much more militant, I find that very radicalizing and inspiring, actually.
I have a question for JA, actually. You know, now it seems like Native people are using economic pressure to force change. The lawsuit against the professional team from Washington, D.C., football team, you know, and the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, you know, going after the banks and trying to get divestment. So do you think this is the path that ultimately is going to have these mascots go away? Or what do you think it's going to take for, you know, sports to lose these kind of mascots?
We've seen attempts at economic influence. The problem is, and I'm sure they have the data to back this up, the support outweighs the protest. So, you know, the reason why they've been so slow to change the Cleveland logo is that the support for it in the markets that they care about has outperformed, you know, the resistance. If everyone got together and just said, we're not going to buy any more merchandise until you change the logo, they would change it like that. But we have yet to see people make the economic commitment to do so. I absolutely believe, you know, money wins out over everything. Mm-hmm. But we've yet to see a mass movement, and I guess that gets to part of the problem. The economic spending power of Native American people, you know, can't compare to the spending power of people that somehow are attached to this logo.
But that's why allies like you are so very
Allies, yeah. So we need allies. Yeah.
So going back to the previous questions about times use and recognizing how significant language has become, how sensitive to the fact that one person is not, or another person doesn't appreciate that. How do we tailor it to fit generally audience? How are we able to do that? How do we do that?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, I feel like Indigenous, I prefer that, and I feel like that's accurate. You're not inaccurate when you refer to people as Indigenous if you're not able to refer to them by their tribal affiliation. American Indian, you know, it's been debated. There are a lot of people who don't mind it, but I think if you just stick with something like Indigenous, then there's really no way that it's inaccurate and people aren't, you know, offended by it.
It's imperative that change take place in the education, in the area of education. And I know that's a long haul, but as long as race-based Indian mascots are in the public schools, they are teaching children to tolerate a form of racial discrimination simply by being there. And they are desensitizing all children, not just Native children, to racialization of this sort of nature. So if we're going to change professional sports teams, we're also going to have to change our education policy. And the key question regarding education policy is how is it good education policy to encourage children to stereotype a race of people? And if you bring that education policy question to the schools on the level of the school mascots, we will finally have a generation of young people who can fight back against the moneyed interests coming from a deep moral root.
And following that trajectory, that means that you all have to get out there and vote.
Yeah.
And you need to run for office, and you need to run for office for those local boards that are a lot of work that don't have a lot of, social capital payback. You got to run for the school board seats. You have to run for your city council. It's not just the gray-haired elders that need to, be part of the political process. And for heaven's sakes, if you're 18 years old this election, you need to get out there and vote. And you need to tell everybody you know that they need to get out there and vote, because that's the way we're going to affect change. Yeah, Jeff.
As a Wisconsin public school teacher, and my head's about to explode here whenever I think about this, I refuse to be a part of a process or endorsing a way of thinking that promotes discrimination and stereotyping. Again, public tax dollars are used, at least in Wisconsin, to promote that. And thank goodness our school district recognizes we're not going to be party to that. So I guess I had to comment before I ask a question. As journalists, as a public school teacher, you're supposed to be unbiased and objective. But my question is, how can you be unbiased when you're talking about something that promotes something that is so bad? And again, we cannot diminish the value of the research. The research, I think, makes this a real obvious slam dunk. Because the research, scientific research, proves that it's bad. So when you're saying that we're being biased when we cover the topic, how do you,
I didn't say that. I was all about false equivalency.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Some people say, well, you got to check out both sides of the issue, when there really isn't another side. The objective part is viewed as being subjective by those who think that everything's okay.
I think this is a good question for Margaret to answer.
No, I think it's a binary thing sometimes where people think, oh, gee, it's either this or that. And the answer is it's not. It's a much more complex thing. And I think in terms of reporting, it's not they said this and they said that. It's some things just are. We know what we know and we see. But there's a real opportunity to make sure that all of those voices are heard. I believe that diversity is a part of accuracy and ethics and a part of quality. It's that instead of just these voices being heard, it's for a richer truth. There are other voices as well. And I think you're seeing that. One thing I will say, it gives me enormous hope to see how diverse society is becoming. The number of people under age 18, it's 50-50 now. It has arrived. This is the future. And your ability to live and to participate actively in a multicultural, multiracial society is going to be dictated by how well you are able to deal with all of these issues. So it's very important to me to see all the young people here who care about these topics, no matter where they sit around the fire here, to talk about what is or isn't truth. I would like to see the young ladies.
Yeah.
You had a question?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so earlier, as he was talking about that, that's when I was going to bring in where does the ethics come in with journalism, because that is a super, super, super important thing to any journalist, is what is crossing the line, what is right, and what can we do to try to get our word out with this?
For one thing, so there are editorial decisions. It's a fine line between editorial decisions and editorializing, but they have the same root. So the choices you make on what to cover, you could argue is I would use the term subjective. Those are subjective decisions that are made all the time, and some people think subjective equals bias. semantics, but
Yeah.
it's a subjective choice as to what you're choosing to cover. So if this is something that you believe is an important issue for the community, and even if it represents the way you feel, so the decision to cover it, from that point, you're not forcing the issue. As long as there is any type of movement to change the school nickname, to change the logo, if there are any proponents out there that are willing to speak on the record, then getting their side out there is not advancing an agenda. It's reporting on something that exists in the world. If there is a counter to this, to the status quo of these mascots and these nicknames, if there's any resistance to that, reporting on that is not necessarily reflecting an agenda, it's reflecting the world as it is. And you also have people who have the license to do so, who are, without question, subjective, and those are the columnists, for example. So in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post, you had Mike Wise, who spoke about the need for allies. He is someone who was not indigenous himself, yet he's a white man who took it upon himself to go after the nickname of the local NFL team. And this has become a recurring project of his when he was at the Post, and even after he moved to the Undefeated. So he made the decision and to clearly stake out his territory from the get-go. I am opposed to this nickname. I find it offensive. Many other people find it offensive. It needs to go. Everything he wrote started from that point. And as a columnist, he couldn't be accused of being biased. His job, your job as a columnist is to be opinionated, to take a stand. This was the stand that he chose to take using his column. And it's kind of amazing that none of the other local columnists, this problem had been there the whole time. It wasn't a new issue, but he came along and chose to make that his cause.
The line for journalists is that you can't cross is advocacy.
Right.
But we have to acknowledge that people think about things from their own frame of reference. Nobody asks white reporters why they're writing from a white frame of reference. They just don't. And that's the assumed default. And I think it's time for, and speaking of somebody who's been in mainstream journalism for over 45 years, those are issues that we can talk about. Those are things we can say, well, this is a story and we should cover that. And we're not going to just cover this story and send black reporters to cover black stories. Life doesn't work that way. Journalism is about understanding that good stories are good stories and that all of us need to be engaged in those stories. But the line is about advocacy.
And in a story like this, there are facts. It's not just about emotion. The facts matter. And so being able to bring in statistics about Native American self-esteem issues and suicide and success rates in school, these are the kinds of complex issues that you can bring into your story, so it doesn't become, again, that false equivalency of some people, half the people want mascots and half the people don't want, race-based mascots. That you don't want to leave that impression, with your stories. Yeah.
One quick thing. I was talking about facts. So another fact you can use is the fact that Stanford, St. John's, Miami of Ohio, they all had Native American-based nicknames that they changed. And life went on. The institution did not cease to function. The alumni donations did not dry up. The teams have gone on to continued success on the athletic field of play. So there's a very simple fact to argue or to use in favor of changing nickname is that other people have done it and they've been fine. It wasn't the end of the world.
And I'm here to testify. I went to a college, the University of Wisconsin La Crosse, that was the Indians, and I believe I was probably the only card-carrying Indian at the time, and they changed to the Eagles and have had even more athletic success since I left.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any books, movies, media that you would recommend to learn more about the Native experience?
What's the name of that? Well, the one that Karina, yeah, but Charlene Teeters. What was the documentary?
In Whose Honor?
In Whose Honor?
And there's one called Understanding the Harms.
Understanding the Harms.
Those are three that come to mind.
Three good resources.
If you go to IndianMascots.com and look under Education Resources, you'll find a list of a number of resources, videos and books and things like that.
Good. Okay, any other questions? Bob, back there?
One last real quick one, and this plays much better in Wisconsin. But the Green Bay Packers were originally called the Indians.
Yes, they were.
They were sponsored or got uniforms, I guess, from the Indian Packing Company. It was only after about 2 weeks, the Green Bay Press-Gazette started calling them the Packers instead of the Indians. But originally, they took the name the Indians.
I did not know that, but I will say that the very first professional football player in the United States was an Oneida Indian who had played football at Carlisle. And when he came back to the Midwest, there were a number of town teams that were vying for his affection and wanted him to play for them. And Bessemer offered a free apartment, and Green Bay offered a free apartment and $20 a month. And that was the first professionally paid athlete that, that played football in the country. Yep.
I'm curious as to why so many of these teams in school and universities have this history of having being Indian or having Indian names. Like, where did that come from? Like, why?
Yeah, I actually was, the documentary talks about it, so if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But from what I understand from what they were saying in the documentary was that during the Revolution, they were trying to be like less British, and they were really trying to just come up with a social structure that would help them, revolt, So because Indigenous people, this is our homeland, they really kind of tied on to that. And there was a clip in the film from an older movie where they show a lot of colonizers, settlers, trying to wear like Indian war paint and feathers. And so I think it was kind of like an identity crisis for them, and they just needed to cling on to something. And that has kind of just persisted throughout the years. Yeah.
There's a long history of that, from first encounters when the French arrived in this part of the country. Native people assimilated them pretty well. They wore our clothing, they traveled in canoes, they spoke our language. Over the years, there were groups that emerged that were playing Indian, basically. There was this sort of conflicting relationship that settlers have with Indians. Exterminate them, assimilate them, emulate them. But if you vanquish them and you objectify them, then if you're saying that Native Americans are strong warriors and you imbue them with all these crazy, they can see in the dark and they can put their head to the ground and hear, 150 miles away, they can see things from a single bent blade of grass. If you establish them as superior warriors and yet you have vanquished them, there's a certain power in that. And over time, and it's not just in this country, you can go to Germany and there are German men who go off on wild man weekends and paint their faces and bang a drum, and this sort of appropriation of culture is complicated, but it's been here almost from the moment that Europeans set foot on this continent. I think we have time for maybe one more question. If not, okay, thank you so much. Yeah, these were great questions.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.